Hey everyone, my name is Nick Wignall. I'm a clinical psychologist and the founder of The Friendly Mind, a free weekly newsletter where I share practical, evidence-based advice for emotional health and well-being. Today, I'm going to take a reader question about anxiety, specifically anxiety where we don't really understand what's causing it. Here we go. A reader asks, one of the main obstacles I face recently is a heightened amount of anxiety without reason. I am able to cope with it, but it strikes me as odd that I'm noticing this increase of feeling anxiety for what seems like no apparent reason or trigger. So it's important to understand up front that there will always be times when you feel anxious and you don't understand why. That's entirely normal. It's just sometimes you're just not going to know. That uncertainty about anxiety is inevitable to some extent. I say that because you don't want to fall into the trap of, in kind of this black and white way, thinking, well, if I just try hard enough, I'll always know what's causing my anxiety. It's never going to happen, no matter how self-aware you are or how good you are at sort of noticing patterns of anxiety. There are always going to be times of uncertainty in terms of the origins of your anxiety. That said, it can be helpful to get better at understanding what the origins of your anxiety are, and that is a skill to a large extent that you can improve. You can become more self-aware about the causes of your anxiety. Here are a few things to keep in mind. Just because you don't notice a reason for anxiety doesn't mean there isn't one. Emotional awareness is a skill, and if I'm totally honest, it's a skill that most of us are not particularly good at. Which makes sense if you think about it. I mean, no one learns growing up how to become more emotionally aware. It's not a class you get taught in elementary school or high school or college or anywhere, really. The analogy would be something like, you're listening to a song on the radio. How often when you're listening to music casually, do you notice key changes in a song? I can tell you it's virtually never. Maybe I'll register that all of a sudden a song sounds a little bit different, but I probably wouldn't put it together that it's because there's a key change. Now, there's probably a handful of people, professional musicians or composers, who always hear that kind of stuff and know exactly what's going on. But they're the tiny, tiny majority because, and this is key, they've spent years and years practicing learning about music and writing music and developing a sensitivity to key changes. So that's why they're so good at noticing it. So how long have you spent working on understanding and being aware of the causes of your anxiety? Have you been training for this for years? Did you go to school for it? No, of course not. Nobody does. Even me, I'm a psychologist, right? And my training in psychology, it did not involve a whole lot of emotional awareness training. So while you might experience anxiety for no reason, again, that doesn't mean there isn't a reason, but at the same time, you want to be careful not to insist that you must find the reason. Emotional curiosity is the healthy middle ground between ignorance and obsession. Anything can trigger anxiety, but only thoughts cause it. So imagine you are, let's say, driving home from work and you're driving on the freeway and you see this big billboard all of a sudden. And it's this very attractive, alert-looking person smiling, these big white teeth, right? But then you feel anxious and you realize you're feeling anxious because you forgot to make a dentist appointment. So what happened? Did the billboard cause you to be anxious? No, of course not. Billboards don't cause anxiety. The billboard triggered a thought about having forgotten to schedule your dental appointment. But even then, it's probably not the thought about forgetting to schedule a dental appointment that triggered anxiety. It might be a follow-up thought to that one, such as like, shoot, now I'm going to have cavities and it's going to be really expensive or it's going to be super painful. Something like that. That thought about what the trigger means is what leads to the anxiety. Okay? Things don't cause anxiety. It's our thoughts about what things mean that leads to how we feel, including feeling anxious. So if you have a lot of unexplained anxiety, one of the best things you can do is practice tuning into and becoming a little bit more aware of your negative self-talk, especially chronic worry. Don't assume uncomfortable body sensations mean you're anxious. Now, the physical symptoms of anxiety are some of the most common and non-specific that we know of. So things like muscle tension or a slight increase in heart rate or respiratory rate, things like that. These are incredibly there's like 4,000 different reasons why you might experience muscle tension or an increase in your respiratory rate. And while anxiety is one of them, you don't want to jump to the conclusion that because you're feeling some of these symptoms, you must be anxious. So a really good common example of this is coffee and caffeine. A lot of people mistakenly think that coffee makes them anxious. But that's not exactly how it works. What happens is, for many people, especially people who drink a lot of caffeine or people who are especially sensitive to caffeine, it can lead to some body sensations that are easy to misinterpret as anxiety. So, for instance, you might feel jittery, or you might notice that your heart rate goes up a little bit. But feeling jittery and having an elevated heart rate doesn't mean you're anxious. It's perfectly possible to feel jittery and have an elevated heart rate and not feel anxious. I mean, think about exercise. When you're exercising, your heart rate is way elevated, right? But most people don't feel anxious, especially when they're exercising. What leads to anxiety, so it's not the caffeine or the coffee that's causing anxiety. When people feel anxious after drinking coffee or caffeine, the cause is that they interpret those physical symptoms of caffeine as anxiety. So that because they think they're having anxiety, that leads them to be anxious. Right? So it's not the coffee that makes you anxious, it's the misinterpretation of physical sensations inside your body that leads to the anxiety. Now, this happens a lot to people with chronic anxiety because people with chronic anxiety tend to have two very prominent characteristics. One is they are hypersensitive to anxiety. They're kind of constantly on the lookout for anything that might even remotely resemble anxiety. And number two is they often tend to catastrophize, especially catastrophize things related to anxiety, including like strange or unusual body sensations. But you can become a lot less anxious over time by getting better at acknowledging these body sensations, but reminding yourself that just because you feel a strange physical sensation that you typically associate with anxiety, that doesn't actually mean that you're anxious or you're going to become anxious. How you respond to anxiety matters much more than what caused it. Ultimately, try to avoid getting overly caught up in the origins of or whatever caused your anxiety. A little bit of awareness and introspection about the origins of your anxiety can be helpful, but it's not necessary for dealing with anxiety well. Difficult emotions like anxiety, they're sort of like the weather. If it rains on you, that may or may not be pleasant. But regardless of why it rains, how you deal with the rain is what matters. And what you don't want to do is find yourself in this situation where you're kind of like shaking your fist at the sky because you can't figure out why it's raining, instead of just accepting like, you know what, it is raining. What's the best way to deal with that? So that's what you want to do with anxiety. Sure, you can get a little more sensitive to and try to understand the triggers or causes of your anxiety, but ultimately most of your energy should be spent on thinking about, okay, I am anxious. What's the best way to respond to or handle that anxiety going forward? All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you're interested in hearing more of my thoughts and advice on emotional health and well-being, I write a free weekly newsletter called The Friendly Mind, and I would love to have you join our little community.